Five Cities Orchid Society had the pleasure of having Bob Hamilton of Hawk Hill Orchids make a presentation to our society on Saturday, August 23rd, 2025. I think you're going to enjoy this presentation. He touches on a wide range of topics concerning cool growing orchids and has graciously given us permission to post this recording.
Okay. So let's start at the beginning. This was a book I read a few years back, and it introduced me to Alexander von Humboldt, a very wealthy German who traveled the Americas, North America, Central America, the Caribbean, and he really began to define nature, the concept of nature in the 19th century. So up until the 19th century, most people thought the world was just fixed. It was always here, and it was always going to be here. And he was an amazing man. And he traveled South America. This is a picture of the Chimborazo in Ecuador with a partner, Bonpland. And Bonpland, and he collected, I think, something like 5,000 or 6,000 species of orchids and shipped back to Europe. And many of them, of course, were new and never described before. So there's another member of the party named Kuntz, who was a German who actually did most of the actual taxonomy, and they're often referred to as HBK. Okay, he gave us lots of information, and one of them was the concept of isotherms. So this was his map, and what he was showing here was that as you go around the world, as you go to different elevations, you find similar plants wherever you are. You know, there are trees at one elevation, there are mosses at another elevation. That was his introduction, and today we call these isotherms. One of the species they discovered was an Odontoglossum. It was the first described Odontoglossum. This is Epidendroides, it's from Ecuador. Not much to say about it. Not a dramatically impressive species, but the first Odontoglossum. I put this little chart together to show how dynamic the 19th century was. We have cell phones and computers and, lots of things were invented in the 20th century, but I don't think there was ever a century that had a larger change for mankind in the 19th century. For one thing, we went from muscle to machine in terms of the prime mover. At any rate, I won't do too many of it. I won't go over this or read my slide, but one of the things that was invented in the 19th century was not only the term science, but the concept of science. So this was a real change. I mean, up until the 19th century, most people followed what was known as the Nicene Creed, which was, this is the facts, I'll swallow them. Philosophy, science were punishable by death. Faith was the only way that we moved forward and learned. So the 19th century really brought the Nicene Creed into it questioned that kind of thinking. Of course, very famous, Darwin's, the origin of species and his introduction to evolution. There was another man named Wallace who was simultaneously working on the same project. Darwin was a rich man, and he could afford to publish. So most of the publicity about evolution is credited to Darwin. Like I said, there was another gentleman, Wallace, and they corresponded and they were friendly, but Darwin gets most of the credit. And an orchid, he particularly fancied orchids and what they meant in terms of evolution. There's one orchid that he described that had a very long nectary in it. It was from Madagascar, and Dracum sesquipedale. And he predicted that there would be a moth with a proboscis long enough to reach the bottom of the nectary. And toward the end of the 19th century, he actually found that moth, and part of its botanical description is predict this, because Darwin had predicted that such a moth would exist. I'm not going to go through a lot of the 19th century, but we also get the germ theory from Louis Pasteur. We get inheritance, the laws of genetics from Gregory Mendel. we get the concept of sexual reproduction, chromosomes, and what they mean and how they work. So this is end of the 19th century. There was a gentleman named Joseph Paxton in the 19th century who began building greenhouses, and he would eventually build a very large greenhouse. We also know Paxton because he gave us the Cavendish banana, which is the banana most of us eat today, which unfortunately is endangered now because of infections from funguses. But Paxton was a self-taught gardener for a wealthy estate, and he would go on to become a hero in the United Kingdom of England. And this was one of the greenhouses he designed. This was Lord Rolle's greenhouse at Victon. We have a species, Incrustelia pictoniense, named after the Victon estate. And he designed this greenhouse in the most interesting way to get the structural details of how to suspend a large weightload of glass. He actually used the ratios he found on the underside of the Amazon lily. So, yeah. So, and now we refer to this kind of engineering as biomimetics. So, that's the interior of the greenhouse. And he went on to design the Crystal Palace, which became the Great Exposition in 1851. Probably the largest trade show at that time ever shown. I mean, it was there to feature the products of England and the innovations, and it attracted, I think something like 20% of the country attended there, and it actually made a profit. So this is the Crystal Palace, 1851. Those towers at the end, actually, they would pump water up to them slowly at night, and then during the day, those would power the fountains that were there. And they actually were blown up in the late 1930s because they didn't want the Germans to use them as landmarks. Okay. There's the commissioning of Crystal Palace. Okay. And I told you, Victon also, actually, not Victon, Paxton also gave us the Cavendish banana. All right. So, we were gifted these auction catalogs a couple of decades ago, and they give you an idea of what became the Victorian orchid craze. So these catalogs were issued monthly by auction galleries. And if you look at the numbers here, 8,000 Odontoglossum crispums to be auctioned. Next one, over 10,000 Odontoglossum crispums. 15,000 Odontoglossum crispums. 12,000 Odontoglossum crispums. And cattleyas and all other markets. So it gives you some idea of the volume of plants that were being shipped to Europe. And of course, these would be grown. The best would be kept. The very finest would be used to make hybrids. There will never be another collection of plants with those significant genomes from South America ever again. So in today's hybrids, at least those that originated from those original plants, we have a genome that when it's lost, it's gone forever. All right, and just picture of a flower shop, and if you get up close to the windows there, you actually see orchids. So these were not just the purview of the wealthy, they were just in the trade. Go to a flower shop, buy an orchid. It's just like going to a big box store and buying a Phalaenopsis. 6 months later it's dead, but the art of a great hybrid or a great plant is that it dies slowly. 1904, this is the Temple Show. This is a man named Sir George Holford's exhibit. And he had a terrific grower, H.G. Alexander. We still have plants that Alexander hybridized, such as Cymbidium alexandri, probably the first tetraploid Cymbidium. The story I am told is that Alexander actually raised these plants for 3 years and cut all the flowers so that they would be in peak bloom for this particular show. and they were transported there by a private rail car that Sir George Holford had a spur line that he actually owned. So this is one man's exhibit, 1904 Temple Show. That evolved into the Chelsea Flower Show. All right. At that show, a Belgian hybridizer, Wolski, actually showed the first Odontioda, a hybrid made between Odontoglossum and Odontioda, excuse me, a Cochleoda. And there's, in this picture over here, the Odontoglossum nobile that was used, and the Cochleoda nosleana that was used. And the reason it created a huge sensation was the color and the pattern that it introduced. I decided to remake Wolskii just for fun. I did this about 20 years ago, maybe 30. At any rate, that's what it looks like. Another pivotal figure in orchids was a man who died very young, Noel Bernard. And he was walking through a forest, and he stumbled over a decaying tree. And he was the one who put the relationship between funguses and orchids together. But the funguses supplied the embryonic orchids with the nutrients they needed. And this gave them an evolutionary advantage because they were able to shed virtually all of their carbohydrate. So if you pick up a lima bean, you know, it's mostly carbohydrate, which is there to supply the starting plant with nutrition. In orchids, there's virtually no carbohydrate, and they evolved to capitalize on hosting a fungus to provide them with the sugars they needed to get started. And the evolutionary advantage was the seed weighs almost nothing, and it goes huge distances. And this is his lab in France, just a picture. Okay. In the beginning, orchids were actually cultivated and raised symbiotically. You had to have the fungus and the orchid together. You had to choose the appropriate fungus. Then they were raised under these glass domes in high humidity, and success was iffy. But there is some indication, and I'll show later on why it's worth paying attention to, is that those orchids were the ones that survived. And in the case of survival of the fittest, those orchids may have more strength and more vigor than what we grow today. Then an American professor here, Louis Knudsen, discovered that you didn't need to have that fungus present if you sterilize the embryos and put them on a media that contains sugar, because that's what the fungus supplied to the orchids. So you had essentially fertilizer, some water, and some sugar, and you put in a sterile seed, and that's how we mostly grow orchids, the asymbiotic method. Okay, so now we get to talk about ourselves. So, Hawk Hill Nursery. John and I don't have a commercial nursery. We never wanted to grow orchids for money. I hate commerce. I don't have any social networks. I don't have any Facebook accounts or anything, even though I was in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences. We live, just quietly, and we spend 3 days a week at a rented greenhouse in Pacifica, California. There's a picture of the site in 1949. It was probably at one time used for cattle and dairy products for San Francisco. So now we're talking about 10 miles or 5 miles south of San Francisco along the coast. And it's an ideal place for cool growing orchids. So this was a nursery called Valmar Gardens. It became a very famous nursery for a while. It eventually was sold to the state of California to build a highway, a freeway, that never got built. And eventually it's now part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. One of the partners who started the Valmar Gardens was Herb Hager, who was a very notable Phalaenopsis breeder. And many of the things you see on the table probably go back to Herb Hager's work. So there's an aerial shot of it. I mean, we are just literally right on the ocean. There's about 8, 9 greenhouses there. We're officially there as boarders because the person who leases this property from the federal government is not allowed to sublet it, but they can board plants. So we're officially boarders there. And we've endeared ourselves to the person, Shell Dance Gardens, Nancy Davis. We've endeared ourselves to her because we both have skills that we kind of contribute to making all this property continue to work and sustain it. This is an outdoor growing area. I'll show you some of the pictures later on. When we moved in, we built all of this benching. All of the lumber came on top of our car out to there. And it was a project. That's the interior. It's been rearranged a little bit since I shot this picture. It's 125 feet long, 34 feet wide, and when we get there 3 times a week, we're both retired. So. This is the outdoor area. These are some Mozdavilias that John grows. We get along because there's a board across the greenhouse. This is Odons and that's Mozdavilias. If somebody asks me about a Mozdavilia, I just say you can talk to John. And if somebody asks him about an Odon, he says you have to talk to Bob. And that way we maintain our own self and presence. And it's respect for each other. Okay, outside growing area. Oh, I just took this shot. This was actually 2 years ago or so. I mean, we've got a lot. There are a lot more coccinelles right now. Most of these came from a collection that belonged to a flower grower in Colombia, and they were sold to both Norris Powell and Paul Gribb down at the Santa Barbara Orchid Estate. And then when Paul gave up the nursery, he would never release any of these. John went down and just decided to buy one of each. And since then, we've had the opportunity to send plants back to Colombia for reforestation effort. Well, that sounds very noble until you realize that the person who was doing this reforesting had some Mozdavilias, and they had some Igneas, and they had some, various species. And then they found out they all began to hybridize with each other. So that's what happens when you put a lot of things into a small space. Oh, come on, there we go. So I'll show you. John doesn't like to talk to an audience, and I don't mind at all. I don't mind putting my foot in my mouth. So at any rate, I'll show you some of John's hybrids here. This was named for Jaime Posada, the patriarch of Colombo Orchideas in Colombia. We're good friends with the Posadas that own that nursery. These are some other recent hybrids. He's been trying for spots, he's been trying for stripes. Various hybrids. They're very hard to photograph. The colors don't come true. We've tried all kinds of targets and computer programs. They're hard to get the right colors. John also grows Draculas. I think he's probably got the most diverse collection of Draculas in cultivation right now. So these were originally called Mozdavilias, and they were renamed as a separate genus by Lure in the 1970s. 79. They became their own genus, at least for the time being. God knows what will happen next. You're in your 3rd or 4th generation of doing Dracula vampires. He did manage to get a plant, Vampira variety Beladosi, back to the family as a gift, and then a bottle of Malbec from the Lugosi vineyards down in Argentina showed up on our 1/4. We haven't drunk it yet, but we will. So a kind of rare alba form of Gorgona was discovered, and it went for a very high price and ended up in the United States. Like I said, we do a lot of trading with other growers, and John's been working, propagating it. So the first generation, what's known as the F1, familial 1 generation, did not show any albinism, but making further crosses, that trait can be expressed and shown, and so these are some of the things that are coming out of that cross right now. So I mentioned symbiotic versus asymbiotic culture. The first greenhouse we had in Pacifica had rotting benches in it, and John made a cross between two species of Dracula, and the pod split, and some of that seed ended up on the bench. We also took it home and sowed it in vitro, in glass, under sterile conditions. So we had two populations, the ones that were growing on the bench and the ones that we raised in the lab. The ones on the bench way outpaced their growth from the ones we grew in the lab. They grew much faster, and they grew much cleaner. They didn't have a spot on them, no burns on the tip, and they were also the first to bloom. And there was the first flower. So this is so it was named Raven by John, and it was named Lenore after Lenore in Poe's poem, The Raven. And we actually had, up until this year, we had a pair of ravens that we regularly fed at the greenhouse called Edgar and Lenore. They would show up every it's been about 15 or 16 years for feeding them, and this year they sort of disappeared. We don't know where they've gone. Ravens pair, unlike crows, so it was just the two of them. Some more of the Dracula hybrids. These are really impractical hybrids because nobody, how many Dracula do you see on the This is the foundation for Odontoglossum, hybridizing Odontoglossum crispum. The term odontoglossum refers to toothed, tongued orchids, Odontoglossum, and crispum. This particular species has a nice wavy edges, hence crispum. So tooth-tongued orchid, crispum. In the genus Odontoglossum, I will refer to it as a genus in spite of Mark Chase and his revisions. There's another species similar. It's actually preferred in hybridizing because it's got a denser white pigment to it. And therefore, if you put color on top of it, you get a double pass, and it kind of bounces back through the flower and gives a little more intensity. At any rate, I'll show you some of the things that I'm doing with Odontoglossum. This is a variant of that species that just came out from a cross. We were propagating some of them. This one popped out, so kind of fun. These are large flowers. These are like 4 inches across. These were the most popular Victorian flowers. The Odontoglossums were by far the most sought after of all orchids. This was done by a friend of mine, Tim Brighton. It was named after his father-in-law, Jim Mitsubiris. So the black pigment against the white background, of course, it's dramatic. But the other thing about it is it grows at a different rate. So if you make hybrids and you don't break that pattern up, it tends to make the flowers cuppy or distorted. You can really see this if you look at the Miltoniopsis waterfall types, where the lips often tweak and don't look great. This is Royal Wedding. This is an albino form of an Odontoglossum. It's called Royal Wedding because of all things it was used in the Royal Wedding. Up until the last weddings, orchids were the dominant flower in the bridal bouquets of the English royalty. Since they managed to destroy their nursery system, they probably don't have any orchids to use in their bouquets anymore. So anyway, I bought that plant for 400 pounds from an English nursery back in the 1980s, and I still grow it today. And we've taken these albums further and further along. So those are plants that are missing one of the pigments. They have a genetic anomaly. They lost the genes to produce those albums. We call that a loss of function. Usually loss of functions are fatal, but every once in a while there's something that, like the short legs on dachshunds or something, it's not fatal, but it's a genetic mutation that's been bred forward in dogs. Well, I mentioned the first intergeneric hybrid made by Volstein with Odontoglossum by Cochleota. This is a picture of Cochleota nosleana. It's a little red flower, comes from Peru. You learn that the flower colors often reflect the pollinators, so if you've got a red flower, it's likely to be a hummingbird. If you've got a white flower, it's likely to be a moth, and a nighttime pollinator. So at any rate, this does some really dramatic things. It makes nice reds. This one's named after a well-known hybridizer, Robert Duggar, passed away a long time ago, and this is a very famous hybrid that's really in the background of most of our colored and patterned things called Florence Sterling. So I'll just show you, I won't go into too much detail, I'll just show you some of the things that come out of Cochleota nosleana crossed with Odontoglossum. The female tends to be predominant for size. So if you cross a large flower with a small flower, if the female is a small flower, you get small flowers. And if the female is the larger flower, you get large flowers. But not true with color. It goes back and forth pretty evenly. So this was a cross I made some years ago. I gave a flask to a man named Tom Perliti, who has Golden Gate Orchids. It's an accident. If you give somebody a plant, it'll bloom better than anything you have. And these are some more modern things that are coming along now. That's okay. The strange thing is that yellows are really hard to produce. Good yellows are hard to produce, and yet it's the dominant color of all the species. It's just, normally they come out being pretty washed out. But anyway. I mean, having grown up in the 60s and having done some experimentation in the 60s, I love color and pattern. It's really just... and then every once in a while we start new lines. We bring in a species that's never been used before. We make a combination that's never been used before. This is an example. You get to a certain point in life and you realize the number of generations you have left in your horizon, then you don't do so much of this type of trying to produce new lines. But, you know, some interesting things come from it. So these are some of the newer things. Species from Brazil on the left, an albiform, and then the resulting crossing it with one of the big ones. And then that's another generation. So each one of these is like a 5-year experiment. So I'm running out of 5-year experiments. You know, they say we've got an increasing past but a declining future. So. I gave a talk in Colombia, and I didn't realize I hadn't translated these back into English. So it's let my horrible progeny go forward. Victor Frankenstein. I started experimenting, I mean, it came from a laboratory background, with chromosome doubling, where you treat the embryos at a certain stage and you can actually double the number of chromosomes. And it makes fatter, bigger flowers, but it actually does lots of other things that are fascinating. It doesn't work in human beings. If we get an extra chromosome, it's pretty fatal. So, but it works in plants. And for instance, if you grew dahlias, you'd find out that they're, instead of diploids, as the normal form would be, they're octoploids. They're actually up to, 5 times the number of chromosomes they started out with. So I began with a very toxic material called colchicine, which was well known as an antimitotic, and moved into these herbicides, antimitotic herbicides, in the 90s. And then I also have been experimenting with something I call the genomic bomb. So it turns out that if you treat plants under high pressure with nitrous oxide for a period of time at the right stage of development, you can also double their chromosomes. So these are a couple of those apparatuses. One of the left's in our driveway. What are the advantages of being able to manipulate pointing? One of them is you can make seedless fruit. So if you take a standard watermelon and you cross it with watermelon that's doubled up, you end up creating an infertile hybrid, a watermelon that won't produce any seeds. So if you like seedless grapes and seedless watermelons, that's all been done through these types of manipulations. So this shows you, we do our own flasking, and this shows you, if you look at the bottom there, I can already see which plants I've doubled up and which ones I haven't by the diameter of the roots there. We did that with the Monostigilias, and a friend of ours, Andy Easton, recently passed away, came through the greenhouse and he looked at one of John's coccinia and he said, now there's a whole new ballgame. So it's kind of exciting work. This was the first thing I did with this back in the 80s. Not important what the plants are, except that it shows you the 4N on the left and the 2N on the right, so it gives you some idea of the impact of doubling chromosome numbers. This was a Miltoniopsis that I treated. It was awarded in England at the Eric Young Foundation. So one of the other things about doubling chromosome numbers is normally orchids are self-infertility. They don't like to cross with themselves. They don't do selfing. And it's turning out that when you double the chromosome numbers, you can actually propagate them from selfings. And if you can see here at Equihenera, Yvonne Portilla has actually selfed that thing, and those are the population. They're all coming out almost looking all the same, which is another artifact of doubling chromosome numbers. This is a nobile that I doubled up to 4N, because you saw those earlier. This is a Cochleota flavum form, yellow form, missing, that I've doubled up recently. Some of John's work, you saw Victorian all back on the table. Well, that's what it looks like with the diploid form there on the left, and that's what Victorian looks like after you double the chromosome numbers. Same with coccinia. So I like the fact that you call it Pandora, because it is letting things out of the box. Ignea. All right. So I think this is a revealing slide because the arrows point to the, at the top, point to what was awarded AMs back in the 1999, okay? 1999. And this is what that same hybrid looks like after it's been doubled up down at the bottom here. So, all right. Just a few shots within the greenhouse. John does lots of Cuthbert zonis, hybridizing. Great plants. It's great because they're small and they sell for a lot of money if you want to make money. This was a plant that was smuggled back to the United States by a friend of ours from New Guinea, who's now deceased. And that's what it looks like when it's fully grown. So these are fun. I always like this. So these are made with bicycle wheels, rims, with wire, galvanized wire coated, and they're being spun by fans of water coming on the backside, nozzles that produce a fan. And so this allows us to water these kind of sensitive plants when we're not at the greenhouse. They're on a garden timer. There's actually 9 of these at the greenhouse. We do them 3 at a time because our we pump water to them, doesn't have enough power to do 9 at a time, so we break them into zones. We made lots of trips to South America. We used to do a lot of hiking and trekking. I think we're very happy not to do that anymore. It's very wet and muddy, and, but this was a species we found on our first trip to South America in the early 90s, what, 91, something like that? 91, and this was a guy who had confronted us because I'd seen this plant up in the tree, and it turned out to be a new species of Pleurophthala. That's now called Pleurophthalus tedii. And he was very confrontational. He thought we were there to steal lumber or something. And then eventually, when we explained to him what we were doing, he actually went up the tree and got it for us. It's an interesting area of Ecuador because a slave ship had crashed on the shores there in 19th century. So the indigenous population was all African. And very friendly people, a great place to visit. I put one on here on the lower, right on the same trip, we found a new Mazda species, which John named after him. So, yeah. Well, now comes the kind of uncomfortable part. We're warming up. At least some of us realize we're warming up, some don't. And it's probably going to become a more difficult time to grow orchids. Certainly, I know our cherry crops are moving from California up toward Canada because they no longer flower reliably as the heat increases. We've got water issues. We used to have very pure water in the Bay Area, and we never paid any attention to it. And then one year we began to see a huge decline in the Mazda and we had the water tested, and it came up with 33 parts per million sodium. Well, if you translate that to what the molecule is, that's 66 parts per million sodium chloride salt. It turns out San Francisco decided to drill wells in Golden Gate Park, close to the ocean, and now the water is no longer as pure as it was. My water district, our water district on the East Bay, is actually swapping water with the Delta so that they can continue to provide people with drinkable water. So we're diluting what used to be very pure water with Delta water as it gets mixed. So because of that, I built a reverse osmosis system for the greenhouse. John uses this for his crop, which is a pretty sensitive crop. It's 500 gallons here. And that's good for about one watering. We do that maybe once a week. So it's not a huge, if you consider a household uses 120, 150 gallons a day, growing this big greenhouse of orchids, it's not really using a lot of water. Another impediment for orchids is CITES, Convention in Trade in Endangered Species, is something that was begun to protect elephants from ivory poachers or rhinoceroses from people who thought it would improve their erections. At any rate, it was extended to orchids with very little thought. So now, orchid seed, orchid pollen, hybrid orchids, they all fall under CITES, and it's the most bureaucratic mess you can imagine. Anytime you deal with bureaucracy, you end up with the stupid people given high positions. That's all I can say. So where are orchids today? This is a picture we shot at Floricultura. It's on the way down here. 16 million orchids a year. 8 football fields full of greenhouses. The greenhouses are all partitioned in such a way that these gantries actually pick up the plants from one greenhouse, a gate opens, they move to another greenhouse. So they follow this serpentine path and eventually end up at the supermarket or big box stores. They're wonderful plants. They're very cost-effective way to decorate your house, but they're also somewhat boring, particularly since they produce so many of them. So, I mean, for orchids, it's basically gone from conservatories to Costco. Taxonomy is another rat hole. Odontoglossum is no longer a genus. So taxonomists have decided to, if you imagine a tree with branching, they've decided to come down the tree to a lower level and say, well, everything above here is unsafe. That's great, but we have a horticultural database which is now in danger of being wrecked for all of our hybridizing records, becoming almost meaningless. And these are getting down to my last couple slides. I was sitting in my mother's financial planner's office when she was alive, and he had a picture on the right on his wall of this tulip. Well, this is the tulip that broke the bank. There was a tulip craze in Holland. The prices were outrageously high. This tulip on the right showed up, it's actually in the painting too, that had these beautiful patterns to it. And then they discovered that it wasn't so rare. It was actually a virus that was causing this, and it could be transmitted to any tulip. So tulips dropped from the price of a house to very, very low value. So this was called the tulip craze, and this was the end of it. And I think there's an analogy to what we do in terms of our orchids too. I mean, they're becoming much more common, very difficult for amateurs like us to produce and whatever. John publishes this journal. It's free. It is a very robust journal. It comes out when there's enough content to publish it, usually twice a year. It's got a lot of taxonomy in it, a lot of pictures, a lot of stories. So if you log on to that website, it's a free journal. Originally we used to have memberships, and we used to charge $15 to be a member, and it cost us $20 to mail out the newsletter. So that model turned out to be pretty broken, so we just decided, let's just give it away. All right. My final slide. I shot this picture in Ecuador the last time we left. It's